So we are with Professor Perronne for the second part of our interview about his experience with COVID from a clinical and from a policy perspective. And for the second part, we are going to talk about the approval of treatments or the non-approval of treatments, and also about clinical trials. So maybe my first question is the following. The first study by Professor Raoult had a control group. So he treated patients either with hydroxychloroquine or hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin, but there was a control group, but it was not a randomized control group. And you have all these observational studies that have been published one after the other on thousands and thousands of patients, the most recent ones in Italy, in Belgium, even in Belgium. And these are observational studies, and typically you have a control group and you have a treatment group, but it's all observational, it's not randomized. What is the problem, you think? What is the value added to randomize? Is it really necessary to randomize? It's an extremely important question, I think, because especially in the US, Dr. Fauci dismisses any form of observational study. You can have 100% cure with a treatment. He will not recognize it because it's not randomized. So can you tell us about the need to randomize studies?
I think that Dr. Fauci has not a scientific comment, because randomization was created to be sure that a treatment that is not so good is a little better than no treatment. That was why it was created. Observational studies, when they are very good, don't need a placebo group. If you look in history, you have penicillin G, which were during the World War II. After the war, experts said we could use it for all the whole society. They started with, for example, I remember pneumococcus pneumonia. They treated maybe a dozen of patients, 100% success. They said, okay, that is a standard treatment of pneumococcus pneumonia. There was not at that time a methodology saying, oh no, you should randomize 500 patients with a placebo with 30% mortality versus treatment which works nearly at 100% rate at that time. So that's not ethical. Here we were in a crisis with, for example, for France, 500 deaths every day. In other countries, other numbers, but it was a huge number of deaths every day. You cannot plan a control study. We know it's very difficult to start and to have results. You have to wait weeks and months. WHO said it's not ethical to put a placebo group in some emergency situations. If there was no drug at all available, it should be ethical to randomize versus placebo. But when the wave arrived in Europe and then in the United States and Canada, we knew that hydroxychloroquine could work. It was published. Of course, some say it was not completely sure. Okay, it was not completely sure, but we have a drug that is licensed for decades, who is very well known by all the physicians around the world. Billions of humans took it. Why don't test it? And if we have a big success, it's finished. We know that it works. That is what did Didier Raoult in Marseille. He tested everybody. He gave the treatment early. He had a very low rate of mortality or intensive care unit need. If you look at the statistics in France, there are two places in France, in hospital, where people had a low rate of death. It's the Institute of Raoult in Marseille. It is my hospital in Garches, near Paris. we have lower rates. It's proven. If you look also on an international point of view, you compare countries which use immediately hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin at the very beginning. For example, Portugal. If you compare Portugal and Spain, the difference was huge. Portugal said, treat everybody at the beginning of the pneumonia. We have very low lethality. In Spain, it was much higher. In Morocco, in Eastern Europe, they treated everybody. In Greece, they had fantastic results. In some countries, the lethality was 3%. In France, it was 18.5%. France had the world record of high rate lethality. Because when you count the deaths, it's sad to say that, but when you have an epidemic, you can compare the number of deaths on the number of people in the populations. It's not a good indicator. It's much better to compare the number of deaths with the number of diagnosed people. It's called lethality. And there, France had the highest rate in the world, just behind Yemen. But in Yemen, it was a country in war without a health system. And if you compare the countries all over the world, after the publication of Mera in the Lancet, you know, this fraudulous publication, which was retracted, during 2 or 3 weeks after the publications, in many countries where hydroxychloroquine was hugely used with a decreasing of mortality. During 2 or 3 weeks after the publication, there was an increase in mortality. It was published by François in France. And then, when the physicians heard that it was a fraudulent study, they prescribed again and mortality decreased again. It was, you could say in one country, it is a coincidence, but we observe exactly the same thing in many, many countries. So there was an impact on mortality of the publication by the Lancet.
Was there a legal ground by the authorities to say we need randomized controlled trial? Was it something that there was a legal basis for them to impose that, or was it kind of a pretext for not approving hydroxychloroquine?
There is no need for a randomized placebo-controlled study if you have a drug which works at more than 95%, which prevents mortality. Placebo has no interest. It's confirmed by the old text of WHO, not by the current director, but it's a fact, scientific fact. You don't need a placebo if something works very well. And now the drug agencies have a bad policy because they ask for randomized studies everywhere, even when it is not needed. It was not the fact, it was not like that 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Okay, but the detractors of Professor Raoult will say, oh, he treated young people who would have recovered anyway. So his studies, observational studies, are not necessarily correct because how do you respond to that? You see, I fully understand the ethical part, the need to respect your Hippocratic oath, but how do you respond to these people who say it's an unproven therapy?
Because detractors who said that Raoult cured only mild cases, they should buy glasses to read the papers. If you look at the papers, of course, and Raoult says it himself, many patients had mild cases, but he treated them soon. But if you look at the studies, you have some severe patients, very old, with advanced pneumonias. Of course, there were a minority among all the patients he published. But they are there, these old patients with severe disease, immunosuppressed, and among these patients, the lethality rate was very, very low, a very few cases of death in Marseille. So the detractors said, yes, but in Marseille, they were all young, all in good condition. But they say that Raoult, what he did of the elderly people, he threw them in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. He put them in a train to die in Paris or in Strasbourg. It's scandalous to say such things because, of course, they are very upset because in their own hospitals, they had a very high rate of death. And they are completely upset to see that Raoult and me also in Gash, we cured many, many people. So it's not accepted by the community because it's too violent for them to see that. So they invent legends that Raoult only treated young patients perfectly well. How can you imagine a whole town? Marseille is the second town in France after Paris. They were never old, never with underlying conditions. They are all young and in good shape. That's not it's not possible.
The mortality rate in Marseille overall is 5 times lower than in the Paris area. Is there some scientific case to be made on just on that basis? Because most patients in most of the early treatment in Marseille was provided by Professor Raoult and his team, and so it was early treatment, and the difference in mortality is huge, considerable.
And also detractors say, oh, look, in Marseille, in the intensive care units, patients were not so severe than in Paris, of course, because Raoult and his team, they treated all the people early before they had a severe condition to go to intensive care unit. So if intensive care units saw less patients with very severe disease, it was because they treated them before. So it's magnificent what they did. Really, it's one of the best publications I saw in a situation of epidemic and pandemic. And of course, all my colleagues who say the hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, we should treat with remdesivir, there is no proven strategy. They are very upset about that, so they attack everywhere. But their attacks have no scientific basis.
There were several studies started in France, more the people closer, I guess, to the government, Solidarity trial, the e-COVID trial, and well, we haven't seen much results. What's your take about all these kind of randomized research that has been started in France?
In my life, I did a lot of clinical studies, and the French official study was called Discovery. At the beginning, there are 4 arms, a placebo and 4 strategic treatments with remdesivir and the others. And at the end, under the pressure of the national and international pressure, they added the hydroxychloroquine. So imagine a study with 5 arms. It's impossible to realize in a short term. When you have 2 arms, it's complicated. Many patients, it's long. 3 arms, it's very long. 4, and 5, it's impossible. And they said it's an international study, European study with all the colleagues from all Europe. And after many weeks, after the beginning of the treatment, we saw in the French media that there was only 1 patient included outside France. It was a patient from Luxembourg. So all the other countries didn't follow because it was a very complicated study. And when the French Prime Minister said, oh, in 2 weeks we'll have the preliminary results of Discovery, I said, it's not possible. And then the President Macron said the same thing a few weeks later, oh, in in a few weeks we'll have the results. It was impossible, and this study is not able to provide any information. And the worst of all these studies is a recovery study made in Great Britain, where they used toxic, huge doses of hydroxychloroquine, 12 tablets per day the first day. So we asked the investigator, do you want to kill your patients? It's a very toxic dose that can be used to commit suicide. They said, oh no, it's a normal dose recommended by WHO for amoebosis, for the amebs. But for more than 5 decades, we never used hydroxychloroquine for amoebosis. It's completely stupid to say that. How can an ethical committee in Great Britain authorize a very toxic dose of hydroxychloroquine for a clinical trial? For me, it's terrible.
I can tell you an anecdote, which I studied in England, and I have some friends there, and already at the time I said, what's going on in the UK is a recipe for disaster. And I studied in Oxford, very close to that college where these guys are from. And so I wrote my first article, and you can read it. It's about that study protocol, and I basically highlight the fact, why don't you use hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin in your protocol? There is already proof that at the very beginning that adding azithromycin is going to add, and they even add, and they still have, I think, an azithromycin arm. So they had two different arms. They had one hydroxychloroquine, one azithromycin, and then they had the others. They couldn't get the remdesivir because they claimed they didn't get the medication. But now the medication, they give it to all of them, even if there is no single clinical trial successful proving the mortality reduction of a remdesivir. But anyway, I pointed that to them, and I know that my paper circulated all around in March there, but they didn't change anything to their protocol. And what I didn't know, I don't have the knowledge there that the dose was toxic, you see, because I understand the loading aspect, a loading dose, but how much do you load, etc. But it was, and realize also that at the time, Dr. Zelenko in New York was already using zinc. So if these guys had been eager to try to find the best approach, they would have given a phone call to Dr. Zelenko, and they would have said, well, it doesn't cost much to put to add azithromycin and zinc, you see, and that could have changed, that it could have saved thousands of people in the UK, by the way, thousands of people, just if they had. And I know the Brits, and I know they think they are so full of themselves. You see what's arrogance. You see, they are so full of themselves, and so the shame on them. And I will keep that in the video because these people are responsible for thousands of deaths. They had this huge trial. Did you see the number of people participating? And they did it on the other arms, and then they claim that they have the first. It was terrible, but it was at the very, very beginning, when the protocol was out. Unfortunately, there were not people in the world really checking what they were doing in detail. I wish Professor Raoul, by the way, would have told them in March, hey, you are wrong with your protocol, you see, instead of saying it when after, really late, you see, because I think there is medical malpractice that is involved there, you see, with this. So to get back to the French situation and the not solidarity. What's the name? Sorry, I'm gonna. It's
in France it was discovery.
The discovery. It's not recovery. It's not solidarity. Okay, it's
recovery.
Discovery. So which didn't discover anything. It's the discovery that didn't discover anything, as far as I understand.
So discovery didn't discover anything. It was a great scandal to launch this trial, which was not ethical. and with many arms in the trial. We could see at the beginning that it would be a very long trial. And what is the interest to do a clinical trial if we know that we'll have the results after the end of the pandemic wave, when we count in each country all the deaths? What is the interest of that? Only for science? Where is the Hippocratic oath? You are physicians to treat patients today. You know that there are treatments which work. Use it immediately and we evaluate.
Yeah, and they could have, like in the recovery trial in the UK, I'm sure that after 100 patients, they knew it was not working. The way they were doing it, the way they were treating people. For your information, I checked the details, and they only treated hospitalized people after telling them over and over with the state propaganda of Boris Johnson, whom I knew actually in Brussels, but I met a very, very different person than the current Prime Minister of the UK, I can tell you. They were telling them, stay home, stay home, stay home, protect the National Health Service. And then, okay, they could not breathe. They go to the hospital. They took 3 days to give the median time to get the hydroxychloroquine or the placebo was 3 days. Can you imagine? It's like there was no emergency at all to try to treat these people. Zero emergency.
I'm shocked by the way the different drug agencies in the world gave recommendations about drugs. If you look at the Gilead study on remdesivir, they planned to show a difference on mortality. They didn't show anything, no difference. So in the middle of the study, they saw that at the stock exchange, it was going bad for Gilead. So they changed, Fauci changed the criteria of evaluation of the study and said, no, mortality is not important. We look just at the duration of hospitalization. And then they published, and they obtained an authorization in emergency of marketing of remdesivir in the US by the FDA. And maybe 2 weeks later, it was authorized at the EMA, the European Medicine Agency. And then a few days later, it was also authorized with the French Medicine Agency. I worked years and years for the French Medicine Agency before. I never saw a single drug authorized for marketing on a single study. It was obliged to have several studies in different countries confirming the results. And the big problem with that is that the study, the criteria was changed in the middle of the study. So this study is not really reliable, but they obtain authorization in many, many countries. It's a great scandal for a drug that is not effective and is toxic.
Yeah, I wrote 2 articles, I think, on that day, busy day. It was April 29th. So when Dr. Fauci made the pitch in the Oval Office for remdesivir, but for whatever reason, there was another study that came out exactly the same day in the Lancet that was randomized, control, and saying, oh, remdesivir does not reduce mortality, and it does not even reduce the stay length in the hospital. So it was unreal that he relied on provisional unpublished results. And basically the claim was, oh, if people get 2 or 3 days earlier out of the hospital, that will save money to the hospital system, so we can sell an expensive drug. But there was another study that came out the very same day saying that was not the case. That was peer-reviewed, actually, and you may be familiar with that study, but Professor Orby from Oxford was an author of that study. And still, a few weeks or months later, essentially remdesivir is free for all now in the UK without any form of proof of effectiveness. Yeah, that's basically what happened. So to get back to this thing, it looks like WHO is not doing its work. It has not been doing its work for months. And WHO seems to be saying no to all the cheap early treatments and basically hydroxychloroquine. I guess they will come out very soon against ivermectin too, because that's another threat. Can you imagine? They don't even have the cardiac risk argument with ivermectin. You see, I don't know what they're going to find. But what are the solutions for a proper exchange of information outside WHO for countries, for medical doctors to be able to get really, truly reliable information outside WHO and also outside some of the prestigious magazines now that are publishing garbage studies like Lancet, but New England is also part of the game there with the Bulwer study that is extremely contentious. And I don't know if you heard that there is this Brazilian expert, statistical expert, who reworked the numbers, the data of the Bulwer study about post-exposure prophylaxis, and then he came with an effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, while the study is published saying it's not effective and it's branded by Dr. Fauci and others as a proof that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. But actually, if the stats are done properly, it works. Anyway, so what are the solutions for information exchanges outside these the WHO and all these organizations that put hurdles to effective treatments, early treatments to COVID-19?
As you know, I know very well the World Health Organization because I worked several years for them. I was a vice chairman of the ETAGE group. It was a group of experts for the Euro region of WHO. The Euro region is much wider than the European Union. It includes Russia, republics of Central Asia, Turkey, Israel. It's a huge region. I was vice chairman for vaccination. And I could see during several years that year after year, WHO was going under the governance, under the influence of Bill Gates Foundation. So now WHO cannot say anything without the acceptance of Bill Gates, and Bill Gates wants to vaccinate all the population in the world. So you understand better why WHO never favors alternative solutions, cheap solutions. That's for me a scandal because WHO should be there to protect the poor countries. And what is very important in this crisis, if you look at what happened in all the world wide, the rich countries were the countries where the results were the worst, with the highest lethality rates. The poor countries were the countries where they had the best success with hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, artemisia, natural products, and they didn't listen to WHO. So we are now seeing a kind of divorce between many countries and WHO under influence of pharmaceutical industry.
How do you explain that Greece stood out from the European Union and basically treated people early while all the other European Union countries didn't?
In Greece, they were in very bad social economic conditions after the economic crisis. So they knew that their hospital system was fragilized. And when the crisis occurred, they made a localized lockdown of people who were contaminated, but they did it efficiently. And immediately the Greek government asked their manufacturers to to make hydroxychloroquine. They were not usual makers of hydroxychloroquine, that they did it. And all the patients were treated very early. They did the same thing in Morocco, in Portugal, in Eastern Europe, in Czechia, in Poland. Everybody was treated, and also in Russia. In Russia, at the beginning, the epidemic was not going very well, but the Russian authorities said, now we treat everybody with a round treatment, and they controlled the epidemic. So now we have the international comparison. And now I don't accept that the French and American and English so-called experts say, no, it's not proven, it doesn't work. They have just to compare countries.
So what do you think are the implications for teaching medicine, the medical doctors of tomorrow? What do they need to make of all of that? Because it seems that there are two types of medicines that are appearing. One which is kind of traditional, observational, the kind of medicine I understand, and then another which is kind of big data, web-based, you see, the kind of evidence-based medicine, placebo-controlled trial, huge studies. How do you see the future of medicine and of teaching medicine?
I think now teaching medicine is saying that all should follow evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine was invented by a Canadian physician. If you look at what he wrote a long time ago, he said evidence-based medicine, there are three major points. The first point, it is a medical literature. In some medical situations, it's very clear, the studies are very good, there is evidence that such treatment is much better. Okay, everybody follows. But the second point of the decision is the experience of the physicians. And he says in many diseases which are not very homogeneous, good studies were not done because very good, expensive studies are only made by the pharmaceutical industry. So if there is not a big drug with return on investment, there are no studies. Rare diseases are not studied at all. So they say, in this case, published data are not so good or sometimes don't exist. So the priority is the experience of the physician. The physician who is treating such disease for more than 20 years, he knows perfectly how to do. It's not the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet which tell him how to do. And the third point that everybody now have put in the dustbin is the advice of the patient. You should always follow the advice of the patient. A good physician should say to the patient, here are the data in the literature, good or not good, that depends. Here is my experience, here's the experience of other doctors. Now there are different possibilities, you choose. Normally, it's the patient who decides. But now, if I speak with my colleagues in France, it's the same thing all around the world. If you say, what is evidence-based medicine? They all say it's only the data in the New England Journal and the Lancet. That's completely stupid. Medicine is in a very bad condition now due to that, because especially when you see that the editors-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, for several years say, be cautious. Some articles in our own journal are very bad, are sometimes fraudulous, and the supervision of big pharma with the wrong data. It's not me who says that. The editors-in-chief of this journal say that. So I say that we should go back to the traditional way of evaluation of medicine. It was based on schools. For example, for rheumatoid arthritis, there was in Paris, there was a school of the Bichat Hospital, the Lariboisière Hospital, and the school of Berlin, of Milano, of New York City, and they compared their results. It was not randomized, not double-blind, but it worked very well, because if in one city, in one hospital, the results were much better, everybody followed that. I don't criticize completely the randomized trials with placebo. If it's a homogeneous population with an easy to evaluate criterion, it's the best way to evaluate. But this kind of study is not a good study for everything in medicine. You cannot evaluate everything with that. And what is terrible now, I saw with all drugs that are not expensive at all, with all strategies that were abandoned by all the so-called learned societies, because they were not published in the great journals versus placebo. That's not medicine for me.